Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm Luisandro Mendes de Souza from Universidade Federal do Paraná, and I will have the honor to introduce you to Professor Michela. But before that, I would like to thank Abralin for inviting me to mediate this session and for the organization of this huge event, Abralin ao Vivo. This event is an initiative of Abralin, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, in cooperation with several international organizations, such as Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, Associação de Linguística e Filologia de América Latina, Sociedade Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, Sociedade Espanhola de Linguística, Linguistic Society of America, Linguistics Association of Great Britain, Societas Linguística Europa, Australian Society Linguistic Society, Associação Internationale de Linguistique Appliquée, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. Michela Cennamo is a professor at University degli Studi di Napoli, Federico II. She has worked with several topics, mainly with transitivity and diachronic syntax. She's a member of some important journals, such as International Journal of Historical Linguistics and Italian Journal of Linguistics. And she also was the president of the International Society for Historical Linguistics. Thank you so much for kindly accepting the invitation, for giving this talk, Professor Michela, and now the word is yours.
I have problems.
Okay.
I have problems with sharing with my PowerPoint. Wait a minute. Okay. But I can't see you now.
No, can you see the share screen button?
Yes. Okay. Done it.
Okay.
No. The sharing was not successful. Can you see me?
Yes, I can. Can you?
I can't. For some reason, I can't.
Can you go back to Zoom? Oh, it's
okay.
working now. It's working.
Okay.
Yeah. All you have
Great.
to do now is just to go to the.
But I need to.
Presentation mode.
Yes. Okay.
Great, it's working.
Fine.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can I start now? Because I can't see you. I can
yeah,
just hear
everything
you.
is fine. We
okay.
can hear you and we can see your PowerPoint. Thank you, Michela.
So, shall I start? Hello?
Yes, please, you can start.
Okay. So, first of all, let me thank Professor Oliveira and Alexandro and Abralin for this great opportunity, and it's a very interesting initiative, and it's an opportunity for me to share results of my research. So today I'm going to talk about auxiliary selection and split intransitivity in some Southern Italo-Romance varieties, namely companion varieties. And the orange area on the small map of Italy to the right refers to Campania, which is the region of Italy where I carried out investigation concerning auxiliary selection and split intransitivity. More specifically, I will compare the patterns of invariance and variation emerging from the analysis of the distribution of perfective auxiliaries with intransitive verbs in the perfect and the pluperfect in today's dialects, with the regularities and irregularities appearing in data from 14th and 15th century texts. I will first briefly discuss, introduce the notions of auxiliary selection and split intransitivity, and then I will address the notion of gradients as put forward by Sorace in a number of papers. Then I will give a brief overview of auxiliary selection in Italo-Romance, focusing on Southern Italo-Romance varieties, considering synchronic and diachronic variation. I will make 4 main claims. I will argue that although auxiliary distribution in the contemporary varieties investigated does not clearly identify 2 subclasses of intransitives corresponding to the well-known distinction between class SA anergatives and class SO unaccusatives, the variation is nevertheless structured and neatly accountable within Sorace's gradient model of split intransitivity realized by the auxiliary selection hierarchy. Although this hierarchy was initially proposed for auxiliary selection, afterwards it proved to account for other manifestations of split intransitivity, and so it has been renamed split intransitivity hierarchy. I will show that a gradient approach to split intransitivity offers interesting insights into the striking convergence between the synchronic distribution and the diachronic path of development of perfective auxiliaries in the Southern Italo-Romance varieties investigated, and that there exist aspectual and thematic constraints on the use of perfective auxiliaries, not only in the perfect, but also in the pluperfect. And finally, I will show that some companion varieties point to a change in progress, the reintroduction of an active system marked through auxiliary selection, sensitive to a gradient model of split intransitivity. As is well known, the notion of split intransitivity, unaccusativity refer to the different morphosyntactic behavior of intransitive verbs in several languages, and probably it's a linguistic universal. Intransitive verbs subdivide into 2 subclasses, so-called class SA anergatives, class SO unaccusatives, according to whether their subject shares syntactic, semantic, or morphological properties with the subject, the A of canonical transitive verbs, or with the object of canonical transitive verbs. The distinction can be either morphologically encoded, as in Guarani, as exemplified in 1 and 2. So in Guarani, the only argument of some intransitive verbs, such as be sick, takes the marker she, that is the same marker used for the O argument of a canonical transitive verb, as exemplified in 1b, whereas the only argument of some of other intransitive verbs, such as go, as exemplified in 2a, takes the marker a, that is the same used for the a argument of a canonical transitive verb, with s, a, and o being syntactico-semantic primitives following a well-known terminology. In Italian, the existence of two subclasses of intransitives is morphosyntactically encoded, and it manifests itself in four domains of the grammar: auxiliary selection, past participle agreement, necliticization of a quantified postverbal subject, and participial absolute constructions. And so with some intransitive verbs, such as leave, partire, example 3a, the auxiliary selection is B. The past participle always agrees with the subject. It is possible to criticize with the clitic ne a quantified postverbal subject, as in 3b, ne sono partiti molti, corresponding to sono partiti molti ragazzi, and the subject of a verb such as leave, partire, can occur as the head of a participial absolute construction, as exemplified in 3c. On the other hand, verbs, intransitive verbs such as walk, for A, select the auxiliary have, do not allow the criticization with ne of a postverbal quantified subject, as in 4b, and the subject of verbs such as walk cannot occur as the head of a participial absolute construction, as in 4c. Camminati i ragazzi is impossible. Since the initial formulation within relational grammar by Perlmutter in his 1978 seminal paper, the existence of two subclasses of intransitive verbs has been recognized in the literature, and originally it was claimed that the different morphosyntactic behavior of intransitive verbs across languages reflects the object nature of the subject at a level of representation of the sentence, and that there exists a systematic correspondence between the syntactic and semantic levels, so that agentivity always correlates with anergativity and patienthood with unaccusativity. And subsequently, this claim, the universal alignment hypothesis, was abandoned owing to the existence of several mismatches between the syntax and semantics of split intransitivity, whereby, for instance, verbs of similar meaning may select have in one language, but alternate the two auxiliaries in another language. For instance, blush selects have in Dutch, but alternates both auxiliaries in Italian. Since the initial paper, the initial formulation of the distinction, the debate has focused on whether the distinction was syntactic, semantic, or syntactico-semantic. And so within syntactic approaches, auxiliary selection is regarded as a reflex of the object status of the subject of unaccusatives, and no semantic characterization is viewed as possible owing to the idiosyncratic nature of the distinction cross-linguistically. Within semantic approaches, on the other hand, the notions of unaccusativity and negativity is rejected, and they are replaced by the notion of split intransitivity and the distinction between class SA and class SO verbs corresponding to anergatives, unaccusatives, and the distinction is regarded as purely semantic, reflecting the aspectual characteristics of predicates, and the agentivity of the subject, and in some cases also its effectiveness. And so, for instance, within role and reference grammar, the occurrence of be is viewed as arising from the presence of a state component in the logical structure of the verb, whereas activities select have. So states, intransitive achievements, accomplishments select be, unlike activities. Then other scholars, such as Bentley and Thorson, view auxiliary selection as conditioned by a morphological rule sensitive to the semantics of predicates and determined by the ranking of a number of semantic predicates, semantic properties, such as dynamicity, telicity, and stativity. In syntactical-semantic approaches, the different morphosyntactic behavior of intransitive verbs is viewed as reflecting the different syntactic status of the subject at some level of representation, but is viewed as determined by semantic factors such as inherent lexical aspect and subject control. In subsequent developments, and basically over the past 20 years, the focus of research has been on the investigation of the syntactically relevant aspects of the meaning components of a predicate that determine the variable behavior of intransitive verbs within languages, but also across languages, and their interaction with the syntactic configuration in which verbs can appear. And so the attempt has been made and is being made at reconciling the categoriality of the unaccusativity split with gradient effects at the lexicon syntax interface. And attempts are being made at devising a model of the lexicon syntax interface that accounts for the mapping of a multidimensional lexical semantic level onto a binary syntactic level. That is a model that is explanatory of how gradient variance and categorical invariance coexist in languages and in the human mind, reporting Sorace's words in one of her recent paper. And my discussion of synchronic and diachronic variation in some companion varieties is cast within the gradient model of split intransitivity and auxiliary selection put forward by Sorace. In this model, unaccusativity is viewed as a syntactico-semantic phenomenon in line with Levin and Rappaport-Hovev, but the distinction between anergatives and unaccusatives, class SA, class SO verbs, is viewed as a gradient, as so intransitive verbs can be organized along a gradient illustrated in figure 1, determined by the interplay of semantic parameters such as the degree of telicity of the situation expressed by the verb and the degree of agentivity of the subject. And so at the opposite poles of the hierarchy of the gradient, we have verbs which never show variation in auxiliary selection. They are verbs that categorically select either be, as in the case of telic change of location verbs, arrive, or categorically select have, as with the verbs denoting non-motional agentive process, such as work and play. And These verbs instantiate the core of unaccusativity, anergativity. They consistently select have in several European languages, as demonstrated by Sorace in her 2000 seminal paper, and native speakers' intuitions as to the correct auxiliary are categorical with these verbs. And also they are the verbs with which the correct auxiliary is acquired first in Italian L1 and L2 in the development of auxiliary selection for Italian L1 and L2. As we move away from the pole, the opposite poles, that is verbs which instantiate the highest degree of telicity and of agentivity, the likelihood of variation and alternation between auxiliaries increases. And for instance, in French, indefinite change of state verbs such as grow, which has a lower degree of telicity because grow does not inherently lexicalize the endpoint of the process. The auxiliary have occurs, as in 6, la rivière accrue. With non-core unaccusatives, therefore, variability in, as I said before, variability in auxiliary selection increases. And for instance, with verbs denoting the continuation of a pre-existing state, such as last or remain, in German, with a verb stay, we find alternation. So this is exemplified in 7, der Wanderer hat ist kurz verweitelt. And verbs which are at the center of the gradient, verbs which lack a change component, are most variable on the hierarchy. And for instance, in Italian, the verb scarseggiare, 8a, run short of, alternates have and be, or in German, the verb lie alternates have and be, as in 8b, das Buch ist or hat auf dem Boden gelegen. Interestingly, in some contemporary companion varieties, as well as in Old Neapolitan, the core of unaccusatives, of unaccusativity is instantiated by verbs denoting telic change of state, such as die, be born, whereas verbs denoting telic change of location are coded as more peripheral, so they display alternation. As for anergatives, whereas, as already pointed out, whereas verbs denoting a controlled non-motional activity such as work and play consistently select have in several languages, as we move away from the core, and for instance, with verbs whose subject has a lower degree of agentivity, the possibility of alternation increases. And this is what happens in Italian with the verb yield. This verb, example 9a, selects have if the subject is animate. So Mario ha ceduto if the subject is potentially has control over the verbal process. But if the subject is inanimate, as in 5b, floor, then both auxiliaries alternate. So the point is that the degree of variation in auxiliary selection is a function of the position of the verb along the hierarchy, and it increases as one moves away from the core of the categories. That is, with the decrease of the aspectual specification of the situation expressed by the verb, and with a decrease in the degree of agentivity and control of the subject, and variation is maximal in the middle of the hierarchy, that is at the stative center. The diachronic prediction of this model is that verbs at the core of the unaccusativity and negativity categories are more impervious to change. That initially involves verbs belonging to the periphery of the categories, for changes involving the cancellation of a split intransitive system marked through auxiliary selection. So this model accounts for both categoriality and variation, variation determined by lexical-aspectual factors, and it allows therefore to account for gradients, for the fact that variation affects only certain verbs as the result of the interplay of a number of semantic parameters, while coexisting with the categorical behavior of other verbs. In Italo-Romance, auxiliary selection is extremely varied. Some dialects only select have with monadic intransitives. So for instance, in Sicilian, there is always only the auxiliary have with all verbs in all paradigms. Whereas other varieties, such as some Southern Lazio dialects, only select B. Generally, and several other varieties show inconsistency in auxiliary selection. Generally, one can recognize 4 main dimensions of variation: tense, mood, person, and argument structure, that is, verb classes. And so, for instance, in San Leucio del Sannio, southern Italy, auxiliary selection reflects tense distinctions. So in the present perfect, in the conditional perfect, and in the pluperfect subjunctive, as in 10a and 10b, one finds have, whereas in the pluperfect indicative, B is selected. Other dialects show a distribution that reflects mood, and for instance, the distinction between realis, irrealis encoding of the situation expressed by the verb. And so in San Benedetto del Tronto, Marche, there is a person split in the present and the pluperfect, with have occurring in the third person singular and plural, as exemplified in 11a, a venute, dormite, and b, whereas intercounterfactual perfect, that is in a tense conveying irrealis modality, B is the only auxiliary selected. In other varieties, for instance, in Ariello, Eastern Abruzzese, person is the parameter determining a split in auxiliary selection. B occurs in the first and second persons, as in 12, so si, faticat, it, whereas have occurs in the third person. And in still other varieties, verb class is the parameter determining the split in auxiliary selection. And so, for instance, in Ortezzano, from Marche, the active stative split surfaces in the third person with in the present perfect, and the presence of have as in 13b, with anergatives, distinguishes anergatives from unaccusatives. Unaccusatives, exemplified in 13a, select have for the whole paradigm, but anergatives select be in the first and second person singular and plural, but have in the third person singular plural. Here it's in boldface. In the pluperfect, on the other hand, be is the only auxiliary selected. So whereas in the varieties for which we've seen how different dimensions appear to determine splits in auxiliary selections, and whereas in these varieties, the distinction appears to be quite clear-cut. In some companion varieties, there occurs a lot of variation that appears to be random in the first place, but I will show that the gradient model proposed by Sorace allows us to show that variation is determined by lexical-aspectual parameters, and so that it is constrained. I have conducted investigation on 3 companion varieties: Pompeii in the Vesuvio area, Sorrento, and Portici, which can be regarded as the extreme southern periphery of Naples. The corpus consists in recordings of 30 speakers for each variety, representative of 2 social classes, working class and the middle class, and 3 age bands, young, middle age, and elderly informants, with an age range spanning from 18 to 80. And variation in auxiliary selection involves both classes, and it is higher for middle class speakers than for working class informants. And in one variety, in Portici, variation only involves the working class, because in the middle class, the paradigm of selection is the same as in Italian. In table 1, I describe the patterns of variation that one finds in these 3 companion varieties, and how they can be neatly described using the gradient proposed by Sorace. So in Pompeii, in the working class, oh, I forgot telling you that these varieties most extensively select have. So either only have or mainly have. B only occurs rarely in some persons, but in some verb classes. So in Pompeii, in the working class, B only occurs in the second and or third person singular with telic change of state verbs, that is with verbs such as die or be born or burst. The other verb classes have as the only auxiliary. In the middle class, be occurs in more persons, and it also occurs with indefinite change of state verbs such as grow. And it occurs with states continuation of state verbs for the first and second and third person singular. In Sorrento, in the working class, be occurs in the third singular with telic change of state and indefinite change of state verbs, so verbs such as die, be born, or grow, but have is selected in the rest of the paradigm. In the middle class, on the other hand, be appears to have a higher degree of occurrence because it also occurs with telic change of location verbs such as arrive, leave, and state continuation of state verbs such as remain. Whereas motional activity verbs and non-motional activity verbs select have. In particular, in the working class, be is the auxiliary used for verbs such as die, be born, grow. Have occurs with change of location, telic change of location verbs, to the exception of be in the third singular, and be also occurs with state continuation of state verbs. Whereas have occurs for motional activity verbs and for non-motional activity verbs and for motional activity verbs such as run, that, however, select be in the third singular in its telic use. The middle class, as I said before, on the other hand, conforms to the Italian paradigm. And in 14, I give some paradigms. And for instance, in 14b, we have the paradigm for some elderly working class informants for definite change of state verbs such as be born. 14b, aggiornate, anate, ennate, with be in the third person singular. And in Sorrento, example 15, speakers often have uncertainties in the selection of have or be in the third person, and so ennate, ennate, and only syntactic doubling allows you to differentiate between have and be. So the distribution of auxiliary selection in Pompeii, Sorrento, and Portici reveals a change in progress, the gradual re-establishing of a split intransitivity system through auxiliary selection, probably owing to the influence of Italian, involving to a different extent both the working class and the middle class, whose system of auxiliary selection is more clearly oriented towards Italian. And three contemporary companion varieties that I have described seem to represent different stages of this change. In Pompeii and Sorrento, the change in progress is quite noticeable, although to a different extent and with differences involving social classes. It is only starting in the working class in Pompeii, whereas it is pronounced in Sorrento. And in Portici, the change is well advanced, because here in the idiolects of some elderly speakers of the low class, auxiliary selection does seem to differentiate two subclasses of intransitive verbs, although along different lines from contemporary Italian, because auxiliary selection opposes verbs denoting change of state, state continuation of a state which select be, to verbs denoting telic change of location, which select be, have and be in the third singular, whereas verbs denoting non-motional activity and select have in the whole paradigm. Now, as we can see, then the variation in auxiliary selection appears to follow the ash and reveals the gradual introduction of be into a system where have is the main auxiliary. And so be has started invading the functional domains covered by have, and the process appears to have started from the core of the category of unaccusativity, that is, from telic change of state verbs, moving downwards along the various points of the hierarchy, consistently with the ash and its implicational relationship. And so if be occurs with continuation of state verbs, it also occurs with change of location and change of state verbs. But we never find be with change of location verbs, but not also with change of state verbs. And so the data seem to pose an apparent contradiction with Yash, because we have variable auxiliary selection involving core unaccusatives that are predicted instead to be diachronically stable. But then we shall see that this is only an apparent contradiction, but it is not. And in fact, the ash is confirmed. So in some companion varieties, be is gaining ground over have, starting from verbs denoting definite change of state, with a path that is consistent with the ash and its implications. In companion varieties, alternation in auxiliary selection also affects the pluperfect. And the analysis of variation in two varieties, Arzano, a town at the outskirts of Naples, and San Sebastiano on the Vesuvio area, shows the alternation of three auxiliaries, have, be, and the form save. A form whose etymology is unclear and controversial, and that appears to function both as a tense aspect marker and as an SO marker, for instance, in San Sebastiano and in Arzano. In 17, I give examples of a paradigm, of the paradigm of auxiliary selection with the verb leave. 17b, save, sieve, save, saven, seven, seven. In this variety, save alternates with be. That is the auxiliary most typically used, and some speakers tend to use save only in some persons, in the second singular, second plural, preferring be with anergatives. And in table 2, I have given a description, an overview of the distribution of these three auxiliaries. And here again, what looks like idiosyncratic variation, random variation, can be neatly organized if we consider the lexical semantic features that appear to determine its distribution, the distribution of auxiliaries. And so both in the working class and in the middle class, save occurs with unaccusative verbs, both core and peripheral. So definite change of state verbs such as be born, indefinite change of state verbs such as grow, telic change of location verbs such as arrive, continuation of state verbs such as remain, existence of a state such as like. And save, however, is somehow recessive, in the sense that be, so it was the original auxiliary replaced by be that is the most frequent auxiliary. Recall that save for several informants only occurs in the second singular and or plural. With anergatives, both peripheral and core, save never occurs, but two auxiliaries appear to alternate, be and have. And interestingly, with a verb denoting an uncontrolled process, such as tremble, be occurs if the subject is inanimate, but have if the subject is animate. Whereas with core anergative verbs, have occurs in some persons. So, and if you look at the section with middle, we have just the paradigm for middle classes, for the middle class, then it is interesting to see that be does not occur. So we clearly have a change in progress with have penetrating into the system, into a paradigm where for anergatives, be is the most frequent auxiliary, and save has already been lost because with anergatives it does not occur. If we now consider the distribution of these three auxiliaries in the other variety investigated, San Sebastiano al Vesuvio, although the auxiliaries are the same, the form save, be, and have, their distribution is different. And as you can notice, save occurs for the working class, certainly for elderly and middle-aged informants, with all verbs. So with both unaccusatives and anergatives. And so save in for these informants, elderly and middle-aged speakers of the working class, appears to be a 10th aspect marker. And save also occurs, although always confined to some persons, the second singular and or plural, also occurs for the middle class, but it does not occur for young informants of the working class and the middle class with core anergatives. And here we find alternation between be and have. And so here in this variety too, we have a change in progress, the withdrawal of save from the middle class, a process that appears to be completed for core anergatives, where save does not occur, with be and have alternating in different persons. And with anergatives, there also occurs the auxiliary have, although most typically in the second person singular plural, with all monadic intransitives. And its use is more prominent with core anergatives and less frequent with core unaccusatives, with which be is the main auxiliary. And so also in this variety, a distribution that would seem idiosyncratic can be neatly described and by using the gradient, the auxiliary selection hierarchy. And above all, this model allows to show us that not only variation is systematic, but that it is also constrained. Now, I just want to say then a few words on the notion on the form save that we have seen for the companion varieties investigated. This form raises a number of synchronic, diachronic, and theoretical issues. It is not clear how to interpret it synchronically, whether it is an allomorph of have or an allomorph of be. It is unclear how it arose and what is the source of initial S of save. And certainly this form provides further empirical evidence for have and be as tense aspect markers that may come to reflect the argument's structure status of verbal arguments, although this is not necessarily so. So we've seen that save is a tense aspect marker in San Sebastiano because it occurs with all monadic intransitives, but it is coming to differentiate two subclasses of intransitives. So it is coming to become NSO markers because it has disappeared from, it has been lost for anergatives in this variety. And the companion data show the possible co-occurrence and competition of several different auxiliaries in the continuous tension towards the elimination and reintroduction of coding patterns of the active type through auxiliary selection, as discussed by Lafauci and Bentley. Hints as to the origin, to the etymology of the form save and its variants comes from a northeastern Abruzzese dialect, Arielli. Data are from D'Alessandro and Ledgeway, 2010, which show that the form save really comes from the merging of the present indicative of be and the imperfect of have. And this is clearly illustrated in 21. 21a, so the vist, literally, I am so, the had seen, meaning I had seen. Si the vist, you are, then had seen. And evidence for this argument comes from the fact that in this dialect, it is possible to insert a constituent between the two forms which form the form save, solve, as in 21d. So, I am, te, the. So it is possible to introduce, to insert the dative pronoun you, te, between the two constituents of the form sauve, save. And so in Ariellis, we find evidence for the initial merging of these two auxiliaries, a merging that is no longer visible, detectable in the companion varieties, but also in other varieties where this form occurs. This form is very widespread also in northern Italian dialects, and a very interesting overview of the phenomenon is given in the chapter on auxiliary selection in Manzini Savoia 205. If we now consider, so summing up the main findings, before moving to the analysis of some diachronic data, variation in auxiliary selection, both in the perfect and the pluperfect in the companion varieties investigated, is sensitive to aspectual and thematic parameters, neatly accountable through the auxiliary selection hierarchy proposed by Sorace The variation observed in some cases point to a change in progress, the reintroduction of an active system marked through auxiliary selection, which follows a path consistent with the ASH. Several auxiliation systems may coexist within a paradigm depending on the variety, the particular stage of the process of elimination or introduction of a split-S system through auxiliary selection and the patterns involved. We now, I would like to discuss briefly the picture emerging from the analysis of diachronic data from 14th and 15th century, where the widening of where the penetration of have into the B domains is well attested. So although it is possible to identify two subclasses of intransitive verbs in Old Neapolitan, characterized as in 23 and 24 by the presence of B for unaccusatives, verbs such as go, as in 23, Elena era andata, with past participle agreement with the subject, and anergatives, verbs such as fight, activity verbs, selecting have, and lacking past participle agreement with the subject, Achilles aveva combattuto. In these texts, have appears also in domains characteristic of B. So it occurs with existence of state verbs, verbs such as be sorry, suffice, seem, like, telic change of location, go, arrive, indefinite change of state, happen, grow, appear, and more rarely continuation of state verbs such as last, or state verbs such as stay, and very rarely with definite change of state verbs. So there is only one occurrence in a 15th century text out of 10 texts that have been scrutinized, and it's with the verb burst and only with an inanimate subject. And in 25, 26, and 27, there are examples for the verb suffice. 25, avaria abbastata, where you have selection of have, alternating with be, but presence of past participle agreement, and telic change of location, as in 26, se illo avesse arrivato, with auxiliary have, and the same with an indefinite change of state verb such as grow. So the distribution of auxiliary selection in Old Neapolitan can be neatly described and accounted for by means of Sorace's gradient model of split intransitivity. The diachronic prediction of the model is that verbs at the core of the unaccusative and negativity categories are more impervious to change. That initially involves verbs belonging to the periphery of the categories. And this is so for changes involving the cancellation of a distinction conveyed by auxiliary selection. And indeed, the ASH allows one to organize and describe the type and the degree of variation in auxiliary selection occurring in Old Neapolitan, accounting for various cases of alternation. But it also allows one to predict the diachronic path whereby have penetrates into the B domains, becoming the only auxiliary. And this is in fact what we find nowadays in several companion varieties. And the penetration of have into the B domains, that is into with an accusative verbs, appears to be well advanced and probably nearly completed by the end, or nearly completed by the end of the 15th century. Now, the different organization of some of the points of the hierarchy that we have highlighted reflects the fact that the relevance of the lexical-aspectual features characterizing the auxiliary selection hierarchy may vary, both synchronically and diachronically, for a phenomenon which appears to be sensitive to the lexical-aspectual features characterizing the ASH in a particular language. But the discrepancy that appears to occur with the ASH proposed by Sorace is, however, in line with its theoretical assumptions, because languages may vary as to the parameters triggering the unaccusative anergative encoding and determining the alternation. So the widening of the functional domains of have appears to proceed from the periphery of the category of an accusativity towards its core, where only B occurred. And so the data point to verbal classes as the main channel of the penetration of have, although one cannot exclude also the relevance of semantic parameters such as irrealis modality for the presence of have, as pointed out by Ledgeway and Fomentin in very perceptive studies. And so in table 4, I give a summary of auxiliary selection with intransitive verbs in Old Neapolitan, organizing the variation according to the lexical-aspectual features. Variation occurs with the periphery of unaccusative verbs and slowly moves to the core, and the core is hardly affected. There's only one example for telic change of state verbs in 15th century texts, whereas you do find some occurrences of have with indefinite change of state verbs, such as happen, for instance. So there is a striking convergence between the synchronic and the diachronic implicational relationships among verb classes on the ASH. And the data investigated point to two different changes in progress. In today's dialects, we can notice the penetration of B into a system that only selects have as a perfective auxiliary. This is the case for Pompeii, Sorrento, and the penetration of have in a tense, the pluperfect, that only selects be and save, as in San Sebastiano. So we find the reintroduction of the distinction between two subclasses of intransitives marked through auxiliary selection. In the early vernacular, we find the penetration of have into the functional domains of B with the elimination of the distinction between two subclasses of intransitives marking through auxiliary selection. So the two changes appear to proceed in a reverse way, but consistent with the ASH and its implication and relationships. And therefore, a gradient model of split intransitivity appears to offer interesting insights into how a split intransitive system may arise and may be cancelled. And so one can refine the claim made by the ASH, and so say that the prediction concerning the fact that verbs at the core of an accusativity and negativity are more impervious to change is brought out for changes involving the cancellation of a split intransitive system marked through auxiliary selection. So the spread of have into the B domains instantiates the partial cancellation of the category of split intransitivity, and the spread of B to the detriment of have equals instead the introduction of the category of split intransitivity. So, as I said before, the changes involving the cancellation and the introduction of the categories of an accusativity and negativity appear to follow unidirectional implicational scales radiating from a core of prototype with various subclasses of verbs ordered according to their distance from the prototype, that is, according to the number and type of criterial features that verbs have. The various points along the hierarchies may vary, but the implicational sequences remain constant. And so, coming to the conclusions, we can notice that synchronically, that a gradient model of split intransitivity allows one to show that in the variation investigated in auxiliary selection, although it does not clearly identify two subclasses of intransitive verbs, is nevertheless structured, and that the occurrence of be, have, and save in some varieties in the pluperfect, for instance, is arranged along verb classes and confined to some persons, and that it reflects a change in progress, the reintroduction of a split intransitivity system through auxiliary selection. The penetration of B into the have domains, as we said, seems to follow an inverse path from the one whereby have expands into the B save domains, but consistent in either case with an accusativity, a negativity hierarchy, and the implicational relationship. Diachronically, a scalar approach offers an explanation for the path of development emerging from the analysis of some 14th and 15th century Neapolitan texts, with have gradually penetrating into the domains of B. And here, again, the elimination, and we can say that the elimination and the introduction of a split intransitivity system marked through auxiliary selection follows paths and implicational hierarchies consistent with Yash. The data investigated point to some issues for further research, some of which are already being carried out. So the need to study the more general principles at the heart of the implicational sequences instantiated by the Yash and of split intransitivity hierarchy. And this indeed is the work carried out by Sorace and her other scholars and collaborators. And also, it would be interesting to see the principles, or to explore, to investigate the principles at the heart of the inverse distribution of the implicational sequences that we find in the Yash, according to whether a change involves the introduction or the cancellation of a split intransitivity system. And it would also be interesting to detect whether the rise of split intransitive systems follows the same paths illustrated for contemporary companion varieties in other languages which show similar phenomenon, and whether it affects other manifestations of split intransitivity beyond auxiliary selection. So this is the story that I wanted to tell you, and I thank you for listening to me. Hello?
Thank you for your talk. Just let me start my camera.
Oh, I thought that I had talked to myself at some point because I couldn't hear anybody.
We're having some.
I don't know how. Sorry.
I think we had some delay, some time lapse between the talks. So we have some time for questions. Let me see if the audience has something to ask you. Are you listening to me? Are you listening to me?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So I have some doubts about your lecture. It was a wonderful lecture, a lot of data and ideas to process. I would like to hear you talk a bit more about the path of change.
The path of change, yes.
Okay. Do you mentioned at the end of the talk about the question about how this process may occur in another languages? Do you have some knowledge about that?
To my knowledge, an investigation of the rise of split intransitivity systems along these lines have never been carried out. In other words, it seems to me that the interest of, at least not to my knowledge, it seems to me that the interest of companion varieties, not so much so the Old Neapolitan data, because the Old Neapolitan data are consistent with the findings for Old Spanish. So it's they sort of have been well studied, but the variation in the companion varieties investigated shows the reverse change, that is a change involving the reintroduction of the distinction between two subclasses of intransitives through auxiliary selection. And what is interesting about this is that the change starts from the core of the categories and then moves along a lexical-aspectual hierarchy. So what will be interesting to see is whether investigation of the rise of active stative systems may be marked through other tools, case marking, or or marked through other syntactic domains, follows or is sensitive to the same lexical-aspectual features that appear to be relevant for the presence of B in the case of companion varieties or of have. Because the companion varieties, I don't know whether I made it clear, but show two changes involving the rise of a split intransitivity system. In some cases, for instance, in the perfect for Pompeii, you find the penetration of B into a system that only has have. But in San Sebastiano, that is where we have, I just want to try and go, oh.
Okay. Do you want to show the data?
So here you have the penetration of have, but even more so, this is more clearly shown here for Arzano. So you have penetrating into the system, into a system where, for instance, the middle class for Arzano, table 2. Can you see it? So
No, I'm not seeing the slides.
Oh, okay. So
I think I have to share.
Wait a minute. Oh, I thought. Oh, so can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So with core analogous verbs such as work, you only have the auxiliary have in a paradigm where with other verbs, with other analogous, you find be and have. So you have here the penetration of have into a system where originally there is alternation between have and be. So when have penetrates into the system and then a split intransitivity system starts to be renewed, it starts from its core syntactic domains, that is from the core of the categories, from verbs denoting controlled no-motional activity. When be starts to be reintroduced into a system where have is the main auxiliary, then be starts occurring with its canonical domains, that is telic change of state. So it would be interesting to see whether a similar path of development, a similar path of change could be observed for other languages or varieties where we find the reintroduction, the rise of a split intransitivity system. So to my knowledge, there are no studies on this particular path of development, at least not to my knowledge. That's why I said in the end that probably that it would be interesting to detect whether similar paths of developments, but also similar implicational hierarchies along lexical-spectral features are at work in other languages. Because I mean, the companion varieties are extremely interesting because they give you an idea of an ongoing process. You don't find this situation of change in process in other Italian varieties. In other Italian varieties, the distribution is quite clear-cut. So either you have two subclasses identified by verb classes, or two subclasses identified by tense or person. The interest of companion varieties lies, to my knowledge and my opinion, in somehow showing how the gradient approach to split intransitivity can offer interesting insights into how a split intransitive system may arise. I don't know whether I have answered your question.
Yes, you did.
Whether
just one more clarification question. I was wondering if you, it seems to me that we have some kind of cycle. We have a system of have that kind of spreads, and after that we have, you said we have the insertion again of B. So in one moment we have only the two options, and after that we have only have, and again we have the insertion of B. It looks like a cycle, right? Or no?
Yes, it's a continuous. It's the continuous tension, as put forward by Lafauci and Bentley. So it's the continued tension, flux between the cancellation and the introduction of this distinction marked through auxiliary selection. Sorry.
Okay, we have one question from Delia Bentley. Do any of the patterns of reintroduction of B involve the return to a split intransitivity system starting from a person split? She's referring to some of the changes that have occurred and are occurring in companion and that you have discussed it in your talk.
Wait a minute. For some, I have problems. Okay. So can you just repeat the question so that
okay.
Where can I see the question? Oh no, I can't see.
Oh, okay, I can
it's okay. Can you just repeat? So can you just repeat the question, because I had problems with the screen, and so
no problem. So Delia Bentley is asking you, do any of the patterns of reintroduction of B involve the return to a split intransitivity system starting from a person split?
Yes. I thought I had said that, but so it seems, I mean, the interest about, sorry, I'm just trying to.
Okay.
Okay. And so the data, look at the paradigm from Pompeii or Sorrento. It looks as if the B system starts penetrating this, the paradigm from the third person singular, owing to identity between the third person singular of have and be. And for a start, B only occurs in the second singular or the third singular. And sometimes there is identity between the second and third person singular of have and be. And so the data confirm the idea put forward by Bentley and A. Thorson in 2001 about the rise of alternation about according to person. So the evidence we have from companion varieties is that there is identity between the second singular and third singular of have, but also of have and be. And so sometimes, as I said, as I showed before, 15 for Sorrento, speakers have uncertainties whether to use have or be. and say è nato or not, and only doubling allows you to differentiate between the two. So I don't know whether I answered the question, but this was the, so my answer is yes, this is the evidence for
Okay, we have another question. Esmeralda Negrão congratulates you for the lecture and asks, how in your view the gradient model of split intransitivity relates to the process of grammaticalization in voice systems and the typology of active inactive languages?
Now, I've never, well, thank you for this question that is very interesting. I have never thought of applying this model to grammaticalization phenomena, unless, so probably she's referring to to how one could account for the grammaticalization or the use of have and be as auxiliaries in the transition from Latin to Romance. But no, I mean, I've never thought about it. I think it might, you know, it depends on which, actually, I have one question. Which particular phenomenon of grammaticalization within the voice system is she thinking, are you thinking of?
Let's see if she answers.
Because the question is very interesting. But perhaps if she's a bit more precise, then I can, she gives me a tip as to how to answer.
So I was, in the meantime, I was wondering, you said at some point that some speakers may be influenced by standard Italian. And I was wondering if these different auxiliaries have some kind of social valuation in these dialects.
In contemporary companion varieties, Italian is obviously the prestigious variety, and so middle class tends to move towards have for negatives and be for accusatives. Some young informants who identify themselves with the dialects, and so with their roots, tend to use the form used for by elderly people, the save, for instance, in San Sebastiano. But yes, the answer is yes. Going back to the question that was asked before, probably one possible answer is this, that the gradients view of split intransitivity does allow you to account for a split intransitivity system arising in the transition from Latin to early Romance, concerning the different distribution of pleonastic reflexives, se, sibi. But that is not directly related to voice. So at some point in late Latin, you find forms such as sibi vadere, sibi mori, sibi nasci, but se contremulare. So this is a very late phenomenon occurring in 7th century texts, where the use of the dative CB occurs with unaccusatives. Telic change of state, telic change of location verbs, sibi nasci, to be born, sibi mori, to die, but se contremulare, the accusative with anergatives. And originally, so this relates to a grammaticalization process. Sibi, the dative reflexive, comes to be equivalent to the Latin per se, meaning by itself. So sibi mortus originally meant died by, spontaneously, died spontaneously. But then the original meaning was grammaticalized, and then the distinction fixed between se and sibi. So in this sense, probably, we have the relevance of this gradient model to unaccusativity as applied to grammaticalization phenomena involving voice. A reflex of this distinction is in some Italo-Romance varieties, but also in Spanish, the difference between murió and se murió. Se murió means he died accidentally. So I cannot use the reflexive if I say he died in a car crash. So this is a reflex of an original distinction.
Esmeralda was thinking about your own work on dealing with middle voice.
Sorry?
Esmeralda was thinking about your work with middle voice.
But the thing is that what I'm thinking of has nothing to do with voice. This use of pleonastic reflexives that become unaccusative and anergative markers in late Latin follow different paths. That at some points they meet up. So you find in a Romance, you find these pleonastic reflexives, and then they coincide with the so-called middle voice. But that is, it's like two different paths of change that at some point meet up, but they result from two different developments. So originally, this has nothing to do with voice, this particular phenomenon. I've never applied this gradient perspective, the gradient model, to reflexives, to the middle reflexive continuum. That is something that probably, is worth carrying out, but I haven't carried it out yet. And what I've seen so far does not relate directly to voice, although it does relate to grammaticalization, certainly.
Okay. I think that's it. Do you want to say something else, something more?
Well, I think that it would be interesting to really, for me, the next step would be to try and explore what happens when active stative systems arise. Whether one finds the same sensitivity to lexical-spectral features. That is something that I would like to explore. And indeed, if among the people who are eventually listening here, it would be interesting for me to know if they've been working on this or whether they know of any current or recent research on this. And so I thank the people who asked me questions and you all, because you made me think about issues or points or connections that had not thought of, and so giving me some hints for further research. And so I thank you a lot again for this invitation and for giving me the opportunity to discuss the results of my research and also my queries with you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Michela, and thank you all for watching this lecture. And keep watching the lectures and discussion sessions from this event. And please consider becoming an Abralin member. That's it. Goodbye.
Many thanks. Many thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Oh gosh.
Sorry. May I thank you? Am I still online? I just wanted to thank you and Miguel.
Miguel, tá por aí?
I can't see you, but let me see. I really... Okay.
Where?
Can I? Oh, I will. I just wanted to thank you. Hello, can you hear me?
I'm still hearing you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Luisandro?
Hi, I'm still here.
I just wanted to say, to thank you and Miguel, and to say that it was a very interesting opportunity, and to thank you for your questions, and that made me think, and so I'll...
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you, Michela.
Oh, bye.
Thank you.